So hi everybody, and welcome to our webinar on managing replacement heifers. I'm Tracy Herbert, the Research and Innovation Coordinator for the Beef Cattle Research Council, and I'm going to be your moderator tonight. Our session tonight will last for approximately 1 hour, but may go a little longer depending on the number of questions you have for today's presenters in the question and answer period. If you're on Twitter, I invite you to tweet along with us using #BeefWebinar. We are recording this session, and I'll email out the link to the recording to everybody that's registered in the next couple of days. So if you miss hearing something and want to catch it again, or just want to watch it again, you can. Of course, for our webinar tonight, you're going to be able to hear and see our presenters, but we can't hear or see you. So if you do want to communicate with us, type into the small chat window on the control panel, which is either at the top or bottom of your screen. You're going to have to move your mouse to the top or the bottom of your screen. There's also a question and answer box there, and that's where you can type any questions you have at any point during the webinar. Our presenters, though, will answer them towards the end of the session. If your internet connection is being a bit slow tonight, it might help to close any other programs that are using internet, as well as to close the webcam window. It means you're not going to be able to see us, but hopefully it's going to make the audio come through a bit more clearly and hopefully get those slides to load a little bit better for you. So here's what we'll be covering tonight. And with that, let's get started. I'm pleased to introduce our first speaker of the night, who is Tracy Herbert. Tracy is the Communication Director for the Beef Cattle Research Council. So we're not able to hear you yet, Tracy. There we go.
Oh, how's that? Okay, thanks, Stacey. Just get my presentation up here. Okay. So, I'm all set?
Let's go.
Okay, so welcome everybody. I wanted to take just about 5 minutes to share this idea about precision farming or precision ranching before we get into the main presentation tonight. So if you're a producer, that's you. And with a portion of your national checkoff, you're helping to fund beef, forage, cattle related research that can be a benefit to your operation and your industry. And every national checkoff dollar that's directed towards research, we can use to leverage government funds as well to make more research happen. But there wouldn't be much use in funding this research if this is where the results ended up. So we at the BCRC are working hard to get the results of research of value to you in useful and meaningful ways. So in addition to these webinars, we've got lots of resources and decision-making tools on our website. But when you've got more work to do than hours in a day, why is it worth your time to read those articles that we publish, or watch our videos, or run numbers that reflect your farm through the calculators on our website? And, considering that you're listening to this webinar, I'm, probably preaching to the choir here, but what it does is it gets you and keeps you in this sort of precision farmer mindset, recognizing that agriculture operates on really small margins. And so you want to utilize the technologies and, production practices and management techniques that are appropriate for your farm or ranch to maximize your profits. And it's typically called the 5% rule. That just small incremental changes in productivity, price, and costs can really have big effects to your profitability. So let's run through a quick example here and see what happens if we, say, increase our productivity and sale price by 5% each and decrease our input costs per unit of production by 5%. So to do this example, we'll take a base farm. We'll assume that this farm is selling their weaned calves at $2 a pound, and so they're getting about $10.50 per calf, and that the annual maintenance cost per cow adjusted for reproductive efficiency, because not every one of your cows is going to wean a calf, is at 1,000, and so you're getting a net profit of $50 per wean calf. So that sounds reasonable. There's the $50 profit per calf for this farm. And if we can reduce our cost per unit of production by 5%, then for this farm, they're actually doubling the profit per calf. Similarly, if they can increase their productivity by 5%, so increase their weaning weight, you know, their profit per calf has gone from about $50 to, you know, over 102 per calf. And, you know, similarly, if they can increase their sale price, so sell for another 10 cents a pound. If they can increase their productivity and reduce their costs, now their profitability has gone up to $200. And if we can do all three at the same time, then actually increase the profit by over 300%. So, you know, I recognize that it costs money oftentimes to make these improvements, and I haven't accounted for any of the costs that it would take, you know, for this farm to make these changes, like, you know, vet bills for doing herd health consults or preg checking, or mineral supplement costs, or extra marketing, or whatever it would take for this farm to make these improvements. But as long as those things aren't costing more than what they would gain from it, and because the cumulative effects are so big that, you know, chances are they're still increasing their profits in the end. And so to see what this means in actual dollars, for this base farm, for every 100 cows, you know, rather than making a $5,000 profit, it turns into over 20,000. So I know that 5% changes are ambitious. So if we look at just 2% changes, this is how it looks. So if we can make 2% changes in cost, productivity, and price, then our profitability increases by about 130%. So that $5,000 per every 100 cows goes to about 11,000. And for a legacy farm, you know, after about 3 generations, you know, that means an extra $500,000 of working capital for every 100 cows, which is significant. And by not investing in continually learning about and, you know, considering adopting innovations or new ways of doing things, valuable opportunities can be ignored. And so let's see what happens if we assume that things are fine and are maybe not referring to our records, or not noticing when things slip, or, you know, or maybe not doing the work that it takes for maintenance. If any one of those 3 things drops by 2%, you can see what that does to the profitability there. If our costs increase by 2%, but our productivity decreases, then we're actually losing money on every animal. And, you know, of course, it gets that much worse if prices go down as well. So it's not only, you know, important and beneficial to commit time to learning, you know, I think it's become a very necessary part of your job as a producer in order to stay in the cow business. And, you know, as you well know, it takes time and effort and costs to achieve these small net improvements. But I think that by continually taking steps and working day by day to make these small beneficial changes, you know, it can really have a big impact on your profit. So there is an article on our blog that explains all of this, and when you visit it, you'll see specific examples of things that you can do to improve your productivity, sale price, and input costs, in addition to the things that you'll hear from Kathy and John on this webinar. And when you scroll to the bottom of that article, you'll see some comments from producers who have typed in some ideas of things that they're going to try on their operation. And would certainly encourage you to add your own in the comments section there. And, you know, add what you hear from Kathy and John on the webinar tonight that you're going to you're considering trying on your own operation in the comment section there. So with that, I will hand it back to Stacey and get on with the rest of the presentation.
Okay, thank you very much, Tracy. All right, so before we get started here with our next presenter, we have a couple poll questions for you guys. So how these poll questions work, you'll see it appear on your screen there, and you'll be able to choose your answer. Now, these are anonymous to everybody else on the line, so we won't know your response. But the first question here is, do you primarily raise your own replacement heifers or purchase breeding females? Either raise your own or, oh, sorry, it looks like this, this poll question didn't work. So we are going to just skip this one. All right, so the next poll question here, this one has different answers. So at $2 a pound calf prices, how many calves would a 2017 born heifer need to wean to recoup the investment made when developing her? Is it 3 to 4 calves, 5 to 6 calves, 7 to 8 calves, or 9+ calves? And once again, your answers here are anonymous to everybody else on the line. I'll give you just a couple more seconds to get those answers in here. All right. So here was the results. It looks like most of you thought it would be in that 5 to 6 calf range. A couple of you said 3 to 4 calves, and a couple more said 7 to 8 calves. So I'm sure Kathy will have something to say on that when we get to her part of the presentation. Our next poll question here is, what is, or what do you think your costs are for developing 2017 born heifers? So $1,250 to $1,399, $1,400 to $1,599, $1,600 to $1,799, or $1,800 to $1,999, or $2,000 plus. All right, once again, I'll just give you a couple more seconds here. It looks like everybody's getting those answers in. And so it looks like most of you are saying in between that $1,600 and $1,799, but it looks like there's numbers across the board within here. A couple more polling questions before we keep going here. Do you normally routinely weigh your heifers to see if they're reaching target weights at breeding? So the answers here are yes or no. Again, I'll give you a couple seconds. It looks like most people are in on this one. So it looks like the answers here are mostly no, although it looks like about a third of you are saying yes. So this next one here, how long does it take a heifer to return to estrus after her first calving? So some trivia for you. Is it 30 to 40 days, 50 to 60 days, 70 to 80 days, or 80 to 90 days? All right, it looks like almost everybody's answered this one. And it looks like most of you are saying that 50 to 60 day range, but there are answers across the book. And once again, this is something I'm sure that John will have a few comments on when we get to his part of the slides. And this question here, when do your heifers calve? Is it before the cows calve, at the same time as the cows calve, or it's complicated? All right. So it looks like most of you are calving your heifers before the cows, but it looks like some are calving them at the same time and a few just have that it's complicated. So with that, we'll move into our first presenter of the night. So our first presenter is Kathy Larson, who is the Interim Director of the Livestock Forage Center of Excellence. So Kathy has a bachelor and master's degree in agriculture economics from the University of Saskatchewan. Her research is focused on getting producers to understand the value in measuring both cost and production in order to manage and increase profit potential. And Kathy, I'll get you to share your webcam as well.
Yeah, it won't let me share my video, dear.
Oh no.
Is that okay?
That's fine. Oh, there you go. You should be able to now.
There we go.
There we go.
Okay. I just want to go like this. Is it looking all right?
We're seeing the other view, yeah, so just switch it.
Better?
There we go. Perfect.
All right. All right. Okay, I hope everybody can hear me okay, and thanks for the opportunity to come and speak with you tonight over the webosphere. John and I gave a similar presentation last year at the Beef Industry Conference in Calgary, and we've just updated it slightly for you here tonight. I'm going to speak to the economics about raising replacements, and then John will follow up with the reproductive factors. So first off, we had that one glitch question where the only option was you raise your own replacements. I want to get into raising versus buying replacements because not everybody does the same thing, and for different reasons. So if we look to what survey data shows us, in the United States, they have the National Animal Health Monitoring Survey, and so these numbers are already about 10 years old, but a little over 80% of the producers surveyed indicated that they raise replacements. And if we look to our own survey here in Western Canada, the Western Canadian Cow-Calf Survey that was done back in 2014, 80% of the survey respondents indicated that they did retain heifers from their own calf crop to develop into replacements. So the choice is different for each producer. Each producer has different resources and different goals when they make that decision whether to raise or buy replacements. And part of that decision needs to involve cost of production. I think you should probably revisit that decision regularly, maybe annually. And you may need to make the decision independent from what your neighbors are doing. So why buy replacements? Why do some people, maybe you know some neighbors, maybe you are one yourself, you do not raise heifers. You buy in every female that you need to maintain or grow your herd size. It gives you an opportunity to bring in new and improved genetics. It helps you speed up expansion or change your program, change the direction of that your herd is going if you want to make a quick change. It may ultimately be cheaper. We'll get into that. It frees up resources so you don't have to commit pen space or pastures or stored feed, and you can thereby increase the cow herd, so cows that are actually pregnant with a calf rather than open replacements. And you can avoid issues that can arise from improper growth rate post-weeding. And so that sort of goes to that one question about whether or not you're weighing your heifers pre-breeding to see how they are in terms of weight and development. In terms of why do you raise replacements? Well, Maintaining the genetic makeup of your herd is a way. If you pick from within your own heifers that are born on your operation, you know the dams, you know how their mothers performed, you know the temperament of those dams, and you may be going to pick from those top performing cows for your replacement heifers. So a lower cash outlay. I'm not sure it's a lower cost necessarily. We will get into that, but definitely you don't have to put as much physical cash out. You can use your existing resources on your operation. You are able to pick females that you know were raised where you reside, the climate that they're going to be exposed to. They thrive on the way that you feed, the type of feed that you provide, and the way that you manage. There's fewer opportunities for disease introduction, but it needs to be a careful consideration, and don't overlook opportunity costs. So it's an economic term, and I'll go through what is that. If you're not really familiar, you've heard of it, but you're not really sure what it means, I would simply state it's the money or the revenue that you give up or forgo when you choose to do one thing on your operation or one opportunity over another. So here's a couple of examples for you. If you make hay and choose to feed it to your cows versus what's your alternative, you could sell it off your operation, you forgo hay sales. So when I work with producers on cost of production, I actually would ask that they value their hay at what they could reasonably have sold it to their neighbor for. And when you retain heifers to develop into replacement females, you're essentially forgoing wean calf sales. You gave up the revenue you could have received had you sold them at weaning. So thinking of opportunity costs and the cost of raised breeding replacements, if we're going to look at, say, a heifer from last fall that you've raised all winter, you've exposed her to breeding, and you're now about to preg check her for confirmation of pregnancy this fall, I want you to consider both the cash and opportunity costs of taking the female from a wean calf to a bred heifer. So we'll go through that over the next few slides. So first up, thinking of her value as a wean calf. So what I've shown here is a thin little line plotted over the 2017 year. It's posted prices from Canfax for 550-pound heifers. And given that most of us, or most producers, are spring calving operations and typically weaning in what we call the fall run time frame, so that October through December time frame, we want to look at what prices were last fall for 550-pound heifers. They were just under $2 a pound. And if I times that by 550, right off the bat, that heifer that you're choosing to raise into a replacement is costing you $1,100 or $10,095, just under $1,100. And typically foregone calf revenue accounts for about 50 to 70% of the cost to develop replacements. So we'll factor that in. Then we're going to take her through the winter. So last winter, 2017-18, seemed for some of us the winter that never ended. It took a long time for spring to show up. When you're thinking of the diet that you would feed, I'm going from a typical winter feeding program, November 1 to June 1st. This is a typical diet that we would have fed to our replacement heifers out at Termundi Ranch, where Western Beef has ran for 20 years. Combination of some hay, barley, salt and mineral, bedding and yardage. And I've put in prices that are similar to what we've been paying this fall for hay and barley. And I have a little red asterisk beside the word yardage. So obviously, if you were going to go figuring out your own costs, you want to put them all in and do your own math. And especially with yardage, it can vary so much between operations. So I have a little caveat. Strongly advise you do not take 80 cents per day and assume that that's what your costs are. We have calculators available. There's calculators on the Beef Cattle Research Council website, on Western Beef's old website, to help work you through and figure out what your own costs are based on your infrastructure, the way you feed, what you feed. So for this example, it's about $475 or just under $500. And after winter feeding, we're going to then turn her out to grass. So it's June, grass is growing. You may own all your pasture. You may have to rent grass for some of your animals. Either way, I would ask that you either put in the actual price that you paid for rented pasture if you have to rent it for your replacement females, or put in a reasonable price, but you could rent your grass out for. So your cows should, your females should pay, your animals should pay what you reasonably would be able to rent it out for. So I've put 85 cents per head per day and 150 days of grazing. So that works out to just under $130. And during that time, you're going to expose those females to a bull for natural service. So there may be some of you who do fixed time AI. For this example, we're using natural service. And in figuring out what it costs for a bull or natural breeding, there's a few different numbers to pull into play. And I would put in the purchase price of that bull. So I've put in $5,800. Years of use, typically we use our bulls for about 4 years at Western Beef. So that's why I put in 4 years, and then a call value. So 4 years out, what is that bull going to be able to be sold for as a call bull? And I've put $1.10 and a weight of 2,000 pounds. So what I'm trying to figure out here is the depreciation or the value that the bull is decreasing each year, and it works out to $900. So that's part of the math. The next component is figuring out what it's costing to annually maintain. So you saw in Tracy's presentation, she had about $1,000 per cow in her example where she's talking about the 5% rule. So I've put in some math behind the scenes here, and it works out, the numbers I used, it worked out to about $945. This is just for estimate purposes or for showing you an example. So $945 a year for the feed, bedding, yardage, semen testing, vaccinations that this bull would undergo. I'm also going to factor in a chance that he's going to be injured or possibly die at 10% chance, so 10% of the purchase price at $580, for a total cost of $2,425 for this bull. And I expect that bull to breed or service 25 females, so it's just about $100 per female. So we add that in as well, and it works out to just under $1,800 for each replacement female. Next, I have to factor in conception rate. So not every heifer is going to come away pregnant in the fall. Maybe for some of you, you do, but I've factored in a 10% open rate. And I want the breds to bear the cost of the open. So I divide that cost by 0.9 and essentially increases the cost of each bred female by $200, but then I also credit them for the sale of the opens. So I'm assuming that my heifers are going to be about 950 pounds when they're open. And I've actually gone and figured out a price off of Canfax's app for a price projection for this fall for 950 pound heifer, and it was $1.64. So I'd maybe make back 156 once you spread it out over all the opens, $156 credit on the bred heifers. So then it works out to just under $840 per bred female. Now the next step is, so she's confirmed bred this fall. She's not going to give me a calf till the spring, and I'm not going to generate my first revenues until the fall of 2019. So I'm just going to have an example here for you. I've factored in fall of 2019, her first calf, $1,100, I'm going to say, is going to be the revenues. So this is only for illustration purposes, and I've put in a cost of production of $900 per cow. So I'll net $200 off of her first calf, and I'm going to just show you each year. Hopefully she's giving consecutive wean calves, and after 6 calves, so by the fall of 2024, what I've done is I've increased the cost of production by about 2% each year, and I've just put in an estimate of maybe where prices could be. And if I add up all the net profit, I'm just under $1,000. So after 6 calves, she still hasn't paid back that initial investment that I've made of $1,840. And I know that some of you will say, well, when you sell her as a cull cow, she'll pay off everything. But I don't think that that's maybe the best mindset, to be just focusing on, well, I just have to wait till I sell her as a cull or an open and then I'll make back my money. I think we want to try and make sure we get the productivity out of those females. The effort that we've made to raise them and develop them, we want them to have a productive life in our operations and not just always bank on, well, I can recoup my costs when she's sold as a cull. So if I look back over the last number of years, each year along each column, if you look, it says 2008, 2009, all the way to 2017. So this is estimates of calves that need to be weaned based on the birth year of the heifer or the female. So a female in 2008 wouldn't have given her first calf till 2010. She would have needed to wean 5 calves in order to recoup her investments. You can see some of the best years to have been expanding or raising replacements was 2011 and 2009, 2012. Why is that? Well, that's the female that you would have kept from the 2011 calf crop gave you your first calf in 2013, right as prices were starting to hit their stride and really boom in 2014 and 15. So she would have recouped all her investment in just a couple calf crops, 3 calf crops. But on average, a heifer will need to wean about 6 calves, 5 to 6 calves. A large part of you, a number of you answered that in the opening survey questions to recoup her development costs. So just in closing, before I turn it over to John, a heifer's value as a wean calf accounts for about approximately 60% of her development costs. And those aren't cash costs, it's an opportunity cost. It's money that you gave up by choosing to keep her. And on average, she's going to need to wean about 6 calves to recoup that investment in developing her to a bred heifer. Obviously, that varies with calf prices and your cost of production. Cost of production varies widely between operations, so go through the exercise of figuring out what your cost of production is, and then figure out what your females need to wean in order to recoup their investment. And lastly, I think it's important to follow recommended practices to give your heifers the best shot at recouping their development costs. And so John will touch on a few of those in his presentation. So there's my contact information. Thank you for listening and thank you for the opportunity. Certainly reach out to me anytime if you have questions about this presentation or other things related to cost of production. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kathy. So anybody who does have questions for Kathy today, you can type them into that question and answer or Q&A box on your control panel, which once again is probably at the bottom of your screen if you scroll down, or at the top if you can't find it there. And we will answer all of the questions for Kathy and John at the end of the webinar, but you can type them in at any time. So with that, I will introduce our next speaker is John Campbell, who is a veterinarian and professor at the Western College of Veterinary Medicine. Dr. Campbell is currently department head of the Department of Large Animal Clinical Sciences at WCVM, and his main research interests are beef cattle production medicine and antimicrobial resistance. All right, so you should be able to share your screen there as well, John.
Yep.
Perfect. No.
Looks good. Okay.
Yeah.
Great. This is about 20 minutes, and so I'm just going to focus on a few little highlights. And I always appreciate the opportunity to be part of these BCRC webinars, and happy to work with the people that are on here. As Kathy said, we did this before, and one of the first webinars I did, we talked about reproduction quite a bit, and I talked about these reproductive goals and about front loading the breeding season. And really, I got to give credit to Bob Larson at Kansas State. That's kind of his expression, front loading the breeding season, having 65% of the cows bred in the first cycle. Basically gives us heavier calves. That alone should make it worthwhile doing it. We want a high percentage of our cows pregnant. We'd like a uniform calf crop. And to do that, we need a relatively short breeding season we'd like to breed these heifers to calve as 2-year-olds. So, and we want to have adequate replacement heifers pregnant to meet our goals, whatever those are, if we're trying to expand our herd or maintain our herd, etc. And that will vary according to the herd. Some of the other reproductive goals we want to have is we want to have good reproductive performance every year. So we want to have a relatively low risk of reproductive losses. And so we want to avoid the wrecks. And so that's stuff like the vaccination programs and things like that. And we've had webinars on vaccines and vaccination programs in the past. I guess the only thing I want to talk about there briefly about heifers is that's the one group that absolutely has to get the modified live pre-breeding vaccine for IBR, BVD, and usually a few other things are in there. In fact, they probably should have had that at least twice in their life. By the time they get to the pre-breeding stage, they probably should get it at least at weaning and at least as a pre-breeding animal. There's lots of other options once they become cows, and some people say that, well, I can't do that pre-breeding vaccine in cows just because the way I manage my herd or whatever, it doesn't work with my particular situation. I still like that as the best approach in the cows as well. But in the heifers, there's no excuse. You got to give them the pre-breeding vaccine. We're trying to set them up to protect the fetus, and so closer to the breeding season, usually 30 to 60 days prior to the breeding season is the ideal time to sort of get that done so that we provide maximum protection to the fetus. We have to worry about biosecurity. I'll talk a little bit more about that in the next slide. And we want to avoid those diseases like trick and Vibrio and those other things, which often seem to affect heifers worse than the adult cows sometimes, because they don't have the immunity and things like that to a variety of infectious diseases. Maybe not trick and Vibrio so much, but some of the other infectious diseases that can cause fetal loss. We want to make sure that we got good bull fertility, and scrotal circumference becomes important because it's such a important predictor of puberty and age at puberty. So that's the reason we measure all these bulls, or one of the reasons beyond their capacity to breed. But certainly scrotal circumference also predicts the age of puberty of their daughters. And then we want to minimize calving difficulties with our bull selection and all the other things that we do to minimize dystocia. Kathy rather talked about buying versus raising replacements and sort of the economics around that, and certainly there's good reasons either way. But I guess my one big caveat is that biosecurity is a pretty important consideration if you're going to buy replacements. And so if you are going to buy replacements, you need to know a little bit about where those heifers are coming from, the farm they come from, their vaccination program, their history of infectious disease. You can easily bring diseases like Johne's disease onto your farm. This heifer in particular was a heifer that was purchased, and she looks fine, but she's carrying a persistently infected BVD calf in her belly that goes on to infect lots of other calves around the ranch once it's born. And she looks just fine, but she wasn't vaccinated appropriately, and so has this BVD infected calf inside her, kind of like the Trojan horse coming to your ranch. There's a few obstacles to reaching all these goals, and the first one is just this this basic premise that if we took a perfectly fertile bull and a perfectly fertile heifer and we put them together when that heifer is cycling and they mate successfully, there's only about a 60 to 70% likelihood of a calf being born from a single mating. It's just the nature's limits on reproductive success. It's actually higher in cattle than it is in lots of other species, including humans. And it's really, a lot of those cows will get pregnant and lose the embryo by day 14, and then the cow will cycle again when we expect it. So we got about a 60 to 70% chance if everything's going right. If we have poor fertility caused by body condition issues or nutritional deficiencies or something else going on, that number is going to drop significantly. Some of the other obstacles we have is we have a fixed gestation length. We can't really do anything about that. It's around 280 days. So therefore, cows have to conceive within about 83 days of calving if they're going to calve around the same time every year. And then we have this delay in first estrus due to cycling. And so there's this postpartum interval where the cows aren't going to cycle, and suckled beef cows tend to take a little bit longer before they start estrus cycles than, for instance, a dairy cow that doesn't have a calf beside it is going to take. So most of you answered that 50 to 60 days post-calving, which is the correct answer for cows, but it's the wrong answer for heifers. First calf heifers, after they've calved for the first time, take significantly longer, 80 to 100 days before cycling. And again, those are averages. There's going to be a first calf heifer on somebody's ranch that starts cycling at 50 or 60 days after she calves. But on average, those first calf heifers will take 80 to 100 days. Some of them will take longer. That's if body condition scores are good, there's no mineral deficiencies, everything else is taken care of. That's just normal biology, and there's nothing much we can do to change that. So here's my poor excuse for economics after we had Kathy explain it all very well. But you know, this front loading the breeding season, it's a pretty simple way to add a bit of additional revenue per calf. And largely that's driven around management of reproduction and our nutritional management, making sure our cows are in good body condition score. Just making sure that postpartum interval isn't extended. We want our calving distribution to look something like this, and we want it to keep looking like this year to year. So we just have to make sure that we don't do anything that extends that postpartum interval. So now I want to talk about heifers, and I guess our reproductive goals for heifers are that we want them to get pregnant fairly early in the first breeding season, and I'm going to explain the reasons why for that. Obviously, we want them to deliver a live calf, so we have to make sure they're vaccinated appropriately, and we do things to minimize loss, fetal loss, plus a loss of dystocia. But then we want them to conceive early in the next breeding season for a second pregnancy, and that's the challenge because of this delayed time before they start cycling after their first calf. So we have to optimize their nutrition, we have to optimize their maturity or their puberty at the onset of breeding. Obviously, we need to worry about bull fertility, calving ease, and overall reproductive success. I think heifers are kind of a high-risk group, and lots of disease investigations I go to, the heifers are more severely affected if it's a reproductive loss problem. They tend to have more reproductive losses like abortions, stillbirths. They're the dystocia risk group. They have lower levels of immunity. They're probably more susceptible to infectious diseases, and they're still growing, and they're lots more susceptible to nutritional challenges. So any ranch I go to where I see a major nutritional problem, it always affects those heifers and first calvers worse than any other group on the farm usually. So trace mineral deficiencies, protein and energy deficits are obviously going to affect that group more severely because they're still growing. Here's a good example from some research by some of my colleagues here. Dr. Waldner's group, Dr. Vanderweer and Hendrick were involved in it. And they looked at the effect of copper on open rates in cows. And you can see that the old cows, 10 to 14 years of age, low copper had very little effect on their pregnancy rates. That their open rates were pretty well flat. They're the red dots across the bottom of the screen there. Their open rate is pretty well flat, no matter what their copper was. You can see the sort of middle-aged cows, the 4 to 9-year-olds, there was a little bit of effect of low copper, but look at those young cows, the 2 and 3-year-olds, the major impact on open rates when their copper levels started to get low. And these are all cows in reasonable body condition score with a conception to breeding interval of greater than 50 days. So there's nothing else there that's sort of really challenging them. They're all in reasonable body condition score. So the impact of low copper is much more severe in those young cows. Maybe we've selected for these old cows. They've managed to stay in the herd because they can get pregnant despite their copper levels. But it looks like the impact is far more severe on those young animals. So we're going to, heifers are pretty important, and we're sort of setting them up for their reproductive momentum. And again, that's a term Bob Larson sort of coined at Kansas State. We're establishing their reproductive momentum the first time they calve. And so in order to have them conceive early and get them pregnant early, we've got to have a high percentage of those heifers have to reach puberty close to the start of the breeding season. So it's really all about getting these heifers pubertal. The onset of puberty usually happens around 10 to 14 months, sort of 303 to almost 500 days. There's quite a range there, and that can vary a lot by breed and by genetics and other things like that. But this average age probably only means that approximately half of the heifers have reached puberty at that age. So if your heifers sort of reach at an average of 370 days, there's probably some that are younger than that when they reach puberty, but there's probably a significant proportion that are older than that as well. So the onset of puberty is influenced by age and weight, but that's within breed. There's obviously big breed differences, and there's genetic differences, et cetera, et cetera. So we know weight's a highly important factor in determining the onset of puberty. And I remember one exercise we did years ago at a ranch where Dr. Fritz Schumann and I were palpating these heifers, trying to evaluate the reproductive tracts prior to breeding, but we were also weighing them at the same time, and it was almost fairly apparent that we didn't have to bother palpating them. We could have just weighed them to determine which ones were cycling and which ones weren't. There's some debate about the appropriate target weight at breeding, and certainly the old adage used to be sort of 55 to 65% of mature cow weight. Probably the old adage was 65%, and now they've downgraded that to maybe 55%. There's some work out in Nebraska that would suggest that you could feed some of those heifers to reach a lower target weight, and they'd still have reasonable reproductive success. But as you get down lower, and certainly as you get down to that 50% mark, you're probably going to have fewer heifers cycling at the start of breeding. You will save some money on feed costs, and so it becomes an economic decision. It's also an issue whether you want to retain a higher number of heifers in the replacement group in order to compensate for the loss of those animals that may not get pregnant. It's really all a math question, and we want to target these heifers to calve at 22, 23, 24 months of age. We want to give them, we have to give them 90 to 100 days between calving and the start of the next breeding season. You have to remember that they have a longer postpartum period. So therefore, they've got to become pregnant around 388 to 418 days of age, and that's right around the time that puberty is starting in many of these heifers. So they need to reach puberty hopefully at 21 days before the first day of the breeding season. Often, they're just becoming pubertal right around the time we are starting breeding. So what can we do to assist in the selection of those? Certainly, we could evaluate them for reproductive soundness, and it's a management strategy that I don't think a lot of producers do, but I think it is a reasonable one. And certainly, that would be usually prior to the breeding season, probably a month to 2 months prior to the breeding season, or immediately before breeding. And we would just do a physical exam on these, palpate the reproductive tract, and subjectively evaluate if that heifer is cycling. Some veterinarians have done pelvic area measurements in the past. It's debatable value, but that may still help a little bit in terms of genetic selection. Here's from Dr. Larson's paper where he talks about sort of 3 categories that he divide the heifers into when they evaluate them at this stage. The ready heifers, the ones that are ready to get bred, they've got adequate weight, they're in good body condition, they got no structural flaws. We're obviously evaluating them for feet and legs, things like that. They have evidence of cycling on palpation, and they got a normal pelvis. The intermediate ones, they're probably good at weight and body condition, no structural flaws, but they're not quite cycling. They got some uterine tone, they're maybe close to being pubertal, but they're not quite cycling yet. And then the problem ones, the ones we want to identify that are probably not worth entering the breeding season, inadequate weight, poor body condition, immature reproductive tracts, or structural flaws, and maybe we find the free martins and some of those sort of things there as well if we haven't identified them earlier. Well, how well can we do? We've actually collected quite a bit of data on our Western Canadian cow-calf surveillance network over the last 5 years, and here's a summary of the data from 2014 to 2017. There was some year-to-year variation, but it was relatively small for heifers. And so this is 270 observations from 93 herds. So we got herds reporting year after year here. It totals to about 18,500 female observations in total. And so on average, producers in our surveillance network had about 9.7% of their heifers open. The median's a little bit lower there. As you can see, it's skewed left. there's a lot of heifers, which a lot of producers with heifer pregnancy rate open rates that are quite low, and then there's a few with a little bit higher. I guess it's a little hard to interpret this graph because we don't know the length of the breeding season for all of these producers necessarily, for these heifers, and obviously that's going to drive their pregnancy rate. Also, their pregnancy rate may be driven by management factors as to, do they select heifers prior to the breeding season, or do they breed them all and see who gets pregnant and then make their selections there and live with a higher open rate. That can sort of drive some of those pregnancy percentages. But you can see that having 90% of your heifers pregnant is very, very doable, and many producers are exceeding that by quite a bit. I just want to talk briefly about getting that first calf or that heifer pregnant for the second time. And I'm just going to go back to that postpartum interval biology. You know, the mature cow is 50 to 60 days before she starts cycling after calving, but those first calvers are significantly longer, 80 to 120 days, 80 to 100 days. So I guess the big take-home message there is that if we want our replacements to calve a second time around the same time of year, or in the breeding season, or get pregnant in the next breeding season, we need them to calve in the first 21-day period or earlier. They're going to have up to a 100-day postpartum interval, and so if they don't, if they even calving in the first 21 days of the breeding season, none of them might be cycling by the start of next breeding period, and they're perfectly good fertile heifers. They may not start cycling till about the second heat cycle or so of the rest of the cows. So here's just a graphical representation of that. Here's a heifer calving in the first 21 days of your calving season. She's probably not going to start cycling till the second 21 days. So she's only going to maybe get 2 opportunities to be bred. And remember, each opportunity is only a 70% chance of getting pregnant. Here's a heifer that's calving in later in the calving season. She's calving now in the near the end of the second 21-day period. You see that she's not going to start cycling till the very last part of the breeding season, and so she's going to only maybe have 1 opportunity to be bred, if that. So those are perfectly fertile heifers, no reproductive problems, and that's just sort of normal biology. So Larson would recommend that, you know, we probably need to calve these heifers ahead of the cows, really to optimize that. They're going to have this 80 to 100-day postpartum interval to really get their reproductive momentum established, and to make sure that their second calf is going to happen fairly early in the next breeding season. We probably should give them a little bit of a head start. So having them calve ahead of the rest of the herd, having a separate calving season for those, a separate breeding season for the heifers, is going to give them a fighting chance as a second calver to be bred early and to be cycling at the start of the breeding season. Obviously, that has labor implications and economic costs to doing that. It probably not a huge cost in terms of changing the breeding date, but having a extended calving season now and having your heifers calve earlier does have some costs associated with it. So there is sometimes some pushback from that because of those costs, and it becomes a little bit more of an economic decision that maybe Kathy can comment on down the road. So I think it's important to have that reproductive momentum, establish that in your heifers when you breed them for the first time. You might want to consider breeding them for the 20 to 30 days prior to the cow herd. It gives them a fighting chance to get pregnant in the first 21 days of the next breeding season. And in order to be cycling as replacements, they probably need to be chosen from the early calving cows, the first 42 days, maybe even the cows that calve in the first 21 days. You need that reproductive momentum established earlier. There's some pretty good data on reproductive momentum and lifetime productivity. This is one of the more recent studies, but there's been studies done earlier than this. This is a fairly large study done in South Dakota and Clay Center, Nebraska, where they looked at 2,000 heifers in South Dakota, 16,000 heifers at Clay Center, and they compared the heifers that that were born in the first 21 days of the calving period to heifers that calved in the next 21 days of the calving period. So looked at when they had their birth date. And the heifers that calved in the first 21 days, they tended to stay in the herd significantly longer. We were establishing their reproductive momentum. They tended to continue to calve in the first 21 days of the breeding season, and they weaned heavier calves every year for 6 subsequent calvings because they tended to calve earlier, and it ended up being almost an extra calf over their lifetime productivity. That's not the first study that's shown that, but it's probably one of the biggest ones and most dramatic ones that has demonstrated the benefits of having those heifers calve early. Again, if you followed them, and this is just a graph that shows how they exited the herd, you can see that the solid line there are the heifers that calve in the first 21 days. You can see how they stay in the herd longer and exit. The heifers that calved later tended to exit the herd earlier and were out of the herd sooner. They didn't have nearly the same lifetime productivity. So I just want to reiterate that I think that's essential for establishing reproductive momentum in our first calf heifers. We need them to calve early just to give them a fighting chance to calve again in the second, as a second calver. We need to select them so that they're going to become pregnant early in the first breeding season. So that probably means selecting them from the cows that calve early as well. We'd like them to have a calf with little or no assistance, rebreed early in that second breeding season, and then hopefully stay in the herd longer and for a longer period of time and wean heavier calves. So that's it for me. Happy to try to answer any questions along with Kathy. Thanks again for having me involved in this. Really appreciate it.
Thanks, John. All right, so yeah, with that, we will open it up to questions. So if you have any questions for either of our presenters today, you can type them into that Q&A window on your screen. So you will be, if you're not seeing that Q&A window, you can scroll your mouse either to the top or the bottom. It'll probably be at the bottom of your screen, and you will see a box there labeled Q&A, and that's where you can type your question in. If you have seen questions coming in already, I have changed the settings so they will be anonymous from now on to anybody else who's on the line. So you can type your questions in that way. Kathy, I'll get you to share your camera as well. Oh, there we go. All right. So we had a question come in earlier for Kathy. Kathy, what are some of the most common mistakes that producers make when calculating their cost of production?
I'm not sure if it's mistakes or it's just maybe not being aware of all the work that's required and maybe trying to find shortcuts and using guesstimates or other published numbers to sort of quickly figure out their own cost of production. So you have to track quite a bit of information, starting with, I typically would request that you suggest you start with your winter feeding prior to the calves being born and then work through to the point that the calves are weaned. If we're looking at heifers and figuring out specifically for that cost of production, again, just trying to find shortcuts, not wanting to go through the full exercise of looking at all your own numbers. It's an exercise that it doesn't happen overnight. And so just making sure that you use your actual production and financial numbers.
Okay, thanks, Kathy. Actually, I have 2 questions that have just came in here, John. Both of them actually along the same line. Basically, can your heifers be in too good of condition, sorry. And so one person asked specifically if they're over fleshy before calving, is milk production reduced due to fat in the udder, and is milk production reduced for the remainder of their lifetime? I think you're muted, John.
Yeah, I just unmuted myself, sorry. So yeah, the answer is yes. You can overcondition heifers just like you can overcondition bulls, and I guess the issues are as described, that you could increase the fat in the udder and reduce milk production, and that's been fairly well documented in dairy cows. I'm not sure I am as familiar with it of the research of that in beef cows, but I'm quite certain that would be a similar condition. And then obviously the other issue could be that if you're laying too much fat down into the pelvis, you can also create dystocia issues and things like that. I got to say though that it's not a very common problem that I see. I usually see the problem more commonly the other way, where heifers are underconditioned. Will it affect lifetime milk productivity? I think it can if they have too much fat being laid down during udder development. It can affect lifetime milk productivity.
Okay, thanks, John. Another question for Kathy here, and just commenting on general market trends here. Do you know if there's an influx of heifers being retained due to lower per pound price versus steers?
No, I can't comment on that. There might be some other market experts. I guess everybody's, we'll maybe see what happens this fall. I can't make a comment.
All right, thanks. So John, you mentioned that copper was important for breeding cows. Should we essentially just be putting out more copper for better results? Does adding more copper always help?
No, not necessarily. Obviously, you can overdo a good thing, and you can get into toxicity levels if you give too much, and so that's obviously something to be aware of. I guess what I would suggest is that it's really tough to balance all the factors in a ration to sort out the trace mineral issues. Certainly our nutritionists try to do that, and they do a pretty good job, but it's tough to sort out things like sulfates and all the other things that can interact with that. And so one of the tools you might use is actually monitoring trace mineral levels in some of your cows. And probably that's best done prior to turnout in the spring to sort of get an idea where they are and how your mineral program is working. So that's probably a way to sort of evaluate where you are and start to look at trace mineral levels in your trace mineral program and seeing if it needs to be adjusted.
Okay. I have one more question here for John, and if nothing else is coming in, we will wrap up after that. So if you do have any burning questions for John or Kathy, I encourage you to type them into that Q&A box along your control panel right away here. This question for John is, you mentioned targeting heifers to get them pregnant before your cows. Do you have any other tips besides selecting those older heifers to get heifers pregnant at a younger age?
Yeah, that's a good question. There's a number of things that can be done. Certainly, there's some research that would show feeding growing heifers ionophores, so monensin, can improve their gains and their feed efficiency and will get them there. Having them on a rising plane of nutrition as they get closer to that puberty age is also an important factor. If they are close to being pubertal, if they're peripubertal, a synchronization program that you can develop with your veterinarian, estrus synchronization program, can help that, accelerate that a little bit. However, they've got to be peripubertal. They can't be a long ways from becoming pubertal, or estrus synchronization is not going to work. So, and there's a variety of those. Usually it involves using some sort of progestin, either a cedar or MGA or something like that, to start the program off, and then and your veterinarian can help set up a program there. So that will help as well. So, you know, rising plane of nutrition, all those other things. I see there's one other question about the trace mineral level testing, and yeah, that can be a blood test. It can also be a liver biopsy, but often we just use a blood test, and it does have some limitations, but we can still use that to get a handle on whether we're in right range of mineral levels.
Okay. Question coming in for Kathy. You covered the cost of raising your own heifers. What about the cost of purchasing top quality heifers?
So just wanting to know what the costs are for quality females. I mean, if you're looking for what prices are, I would strongly encourage you to do what I do. I have a membership to CanFax, and I watch what the posted prices are in the reports that they put out, or you might be subscribing to other places where you get data sets from. But I don't have any sort of magic tool other than that to give you monitoring. It's a fairly cheap cost to get tons of market data and market information on a weekly basis.
So it looks like just one question left here for John. Is phosphorus as important as they used to think it was?
I think, yeah, phosphorus is still important. It's probably rare we see deficiencies of phosphorus. Most people don't have a problem with that, but I guess if it does occur, it would have a major effect on cycling and reproductive success. So yeah, it's an important mineral, but it's probably not one we see deficiencies in very often.
Okay, thanks, John. So there was another question about finding these PowerPoints, and actually I will cover that here right away. So just hold with us. So with that, I just have a few more things to let everybody know before we get going. So thank you to John and Kathy for answering those questions for us. The first thing I wanted to let you know is how to get more information and science-based production advice through the BCRC. You can go to our website, beefresearch.ca, and click on the subscribe button to sign up for our free email list. If you have a Twitter, Facebook, or YouTube account, you can connect with us there as well. And then I'd invite you to join our next webinar, which will be coming up in November. And so in the chat window on your control panel, you should have seen a link that I've posted twice now for our follow-up survey. I will be sending this link out via email later as well, but I really ask, it's a very short survey. It's, I believe, 7 questions, but I ask that you fill it out because it's really useful for us. We're able to deliver webinars that are useful and meaning to you and helps us to choose our webinars for upcoming webinars based on things that you guys are actually interested in viewing. So please complete the survey and don't hesitate to contact me with any questions, comments, or concerns you have at any time. Within the next couple of days, you're going to receive an email from me with a link to watch the recording of this webinar. So it has been recorded and I will be sending that out, as well as a couple more additional information on managing replacement heifers. So that's it. I want to thank everybody at home for joining us tonight, and thank you to Kathy and John for volunteering your time and expertise tonight. So thank you.
Having us.